Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. Okay, so starting our part five of Peace v Freedom, we just wanted to recap a little bit what we finished off with in our part four episode, talking about how like the 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 victory of the master over the slave is not an obvious it's not an it's not an obvious victory because the slave must acknowledge the master's superiority wholeheartedly. But there's always something that the slave can hide in this scenario because the master, as we quoted from Alan Ryan in his book, and referring over to Hegelian ideas, that the um the master cannot have what he wants from slavery. He wants recognition, but a slave's recognition is tainted, and because it's extorted, it's not recognition at all. And that ties into our next series after we're done with this on the modern empire and about how examples um, of other imperial authority that was too strict, why the people that they ruled over didn't truly submit, and that's why they failed.
Yeah. When we
Um,
look
but
at, oh, sorry.
but yeah, like with the when we look at how humans can convince themselves that they're free when they're not free, we have to also look at other examples of the strength of the human mind and connecting, the peace preservation law in 1925 with Japan or other totalitarian societies, fictional or non-fictional, and about how like the only way that you can have true peace is if you destroy freedom and all its manifestations, and um, and you can only get rid of freedom entirely is if you can if you can destroy that resistance in a person to the full complete peace and to the destruction of freedom, because again, complete peace is the destruction of freedom. And believe it or not, it is actually possible for a person to convince themselves that they're free when they're not free. It is possible to convert a person. And just looking at other examples um, of people that like showing the strength of the human mind. Buddhist monks, they in protest, they have in history burnt themselves alive with no screaming, no noise, no movement or struggle, burning themselves to a crisp without any resistance whatsoever, almost as if they don't even feel the flames. And 21 Savage, people may hear of him as a rapper, but he got shot 6 times, once. He including shots in his head and heart, and he still survived. There have been people, and one particular guy in particular, he ran 350 miles without stopping, running for 4 days straight. No food, maybe some water, but no sleep, regardless of the lactic acid that he felt in his brain, in his body, he kept going because of the strength of his will. And there have also been examples where people have been shot, stabbed, choked, riddled in bed, like sickness, you know, um, and they still survived. And even those that might have died on their deathbed in hospitals, there have been instances where people have died for a straight 5 minutes or more and then came back to life. Something that it's a medical anomaly, but it's the strength of their mind. And then like fictional examples of Darth Maul when he got cut in half and he still survived. For anyone that has seen the animated series of Clone Wars and Rebels, you'd find out that in Star Wars canon he did survive, and he survived because of this sheer will. He survived off of hatred, using the dark side. But that idea, and as well as Vader, getting burnt alive on Mustafar and still surviving. Like we think, oh, that's impossible. No way that anyone could possibly survive that. But humans have incredibly strong minds, incredibly strong minds. We fight, we fight. So if we could do all this, and I'm just scratching the surface of what humans are capable to do in their mind. Um, but if we can do this, we can certainly convince ourselves that we are not free. And that's the danger. That's the danger. That's what keeps us up at night.
Absolutely. As you said, we could survive getting blown up, dying for losing brain cells, and still come back. And
Right.
so
And then
to just argue within yourself to say that you actually are free when you're in bondage, that's a cakewalk.
right, and then a quick quote from Bruce Lee. He is believed to have said, in an interview somewhere, it was meant to be just be something out of a motivational speech, but is actually quite true. We as humans are not afraid, of, and I don't know what the quote was exactly, but it was something along the lines of, we are not afraid that we are inadequate. We are afraid that we are powerful beyond our imagination. We
Exactly.
have no idea how strong we are in our mind. We can convince ourselves that we're free when we're not, and that someone couldn't actually use their mind power to convince us that we aren't free, and then force us to accept it. That is the strength of our will.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredible the things that we could do with our minds, both good and bad. And coming back to, the point of our series, we can convince ourselves that we are free in a situation where we certainly aren't. And at the same time, we can convince ourselves out of freedom. We can completely erase the whole idea of freedom from our own minds through a choice. Once again, that as I kind of described in the last episode, the last act of freedom is to give it up. We could give up freedom in our own minds, submit to something wholeheartedly and believe it, just out of the capability of of our brains. And so it's really, as I said, pretty incredible what we can do. Um, but to continue on in the point that we were making in that last episode, in that complete, if a group of people, if the goal is to ensure complete peace, no disorder, no breaking the law, no murder, robbery, anything like that, complete peace, the only way to really do that is to have com- um, completely zero freedom. There cannot be any freedom. No freedom of thought to oppose whatever system, no freedom of belief that could go against the system, anything like that. That has to be gone. And the only way you come out of that is through you yourself submitting, surrendering that idea of freedom to someone else, or just subscribing to all of a different mindset. One of the greatest, it's a fictional example, but one of the greatest examples and warnings that we've had of this capability is through the book 1984 by George Orwell. If you haven't heard of this book, that's pretty wild. Everyone has. Um, but one of the biggest things that we have in this book, people always take it that the reason that, the people didn't revolt, the reason that the main character, got captured and lost, all that kind of stuff, because, you have this big government that's watching over things and is going to put you in jail and punish you if you ever step out of line. That is not completely how they ensure that complete peace. Because you could throw someone in jail, you could shoot them, their idea that they had, the ideas that they believe, the ideas of freedom or democracy or anything like that, that's not going to go away. It's just going to be out of sight. So in 1984, all the, surveillance methods, all the ways that the party, the ruling party had to watch over and surveil and control its citizens, that's not how they ensured that complete peace. It was getting people to give up the idea of freedom altogether and to completely submit to the ideology of the party. I mean, one of the main mottos of the party in the book of 1984 is freedom is slavery. The whole idea of freedom is, in the party's perspective, terrible. that is only going to make you a slave to continuous war, squabbles, fighting, chaos, which to a certain extent is true, as we talked about earlier in the series. Absolute freedom is absolute chaos and absolute violence. It's not really something that we as humans want to a certain extent, is that absolute freedom. And so, taking advantage of that, the party in 1984 advocates for the people. It doesn't advocate them, it convinces them that the whole idea of freedom itself is not an idea that you should hold. At the end of 1984, the main character, Winston, is, he's apprehended by the party because, they found out that he had some ideas of freedom. He was running around with a different character. He had this banned book, all that kind of stuff. So they brought him to jail, interrogated him, and instead of just torturing him and killing him or doing anything of that sort, what they did was, I would say, even more devious than any sort of physical torture or anything that they could have done. They convinced him through what it probably was, they didn't say, months and months of psychological manipulation, that the whole idea of having freedom was wrong. The whole idea that people should be able to believe and do anything that is against what the ruling party said was wrong. They convinced Winston, and the greatest example was this, he convinced them that 2 plus 2 equals 5. And that again goes to the power of the mind, that you could convince yourself out of freedom. You could convince yourself out of any idea that you have. You could give that up through the will of your own mind. At the end of the book, Winston is completely changed. He's not killed or tortured. I mean, he's tortured and all that, but he ends up getting released from the jail system, the prison system, anything like that. And he's out in the streets. And he's so much different than anyone who was looking for freedom or anything like that. It ends with he looks up at a screen that has Big Brother and he cries because he loves Big Brother so much. The last 2 sentences of the book goes, he had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. He had won the victory over himself, the victory being that he had defeated freedom. He had defeated free thinking, critical thinking, beliefs in democracy, any sort of idea. He defeated that. He submitted to the ideology of the party, the ideology of what would end up being complete peace. And so that's what you get with, that's really the only way that you can ensure complete peace. You could, suppress the population all you want, but they're not going to get rid of whatever beliefs they hold unless you convince them, you get them to surrender that freedom, that belief, whatever they have. That's true victory. That's true peace, is to eliminate freedom altogether. It's to believe that freedom is slavery. I think you're muted.
Oh my God, I'm like my dad right now. This is crazy. But yeah, that's the real scary thing about 1984 is that freedom could be interpreted as something that holds one back, and more accurately, that holds the whole back, because while we may like the idea of being free, if we're looking at how we coexist with everyone else, there's a certain part of us that needs to be held back. And 1984 goes to the full extreme of that. It really brings total to totalitarian because there is the understanding, the idea that you really can beat freedom out of someone. You really can. Brainwash, it's not just a term that we use colloquially, in conversation, to describe much lesser examples of convincing someone of something something that they don't actually want. Brainwash can literally mean wiping away their inherent beliefs that they want what's good for them. In 1984 is such a good example of that. Um, but in our world, because this is a fictional society, and while there are echoes to it of nonfiction, um, and the basic idea of it is that a leader, in a society that promotes peace, is that um, in reality, when they are ruling over their people, or when a master is ruling over their slave, you know, they they really want to be respected rather than feared. And that's the aspect of us about humans, about authority, is that when we have power, we don't want to force others into joining us. We want them to willingly come to us. You know, we would rather be respected than feared. Often it's a question, and I'm pretty sure it has its origins with Machiavelli, maybe. But would you rather be respected or feared? Most people would actually say respected, because feared, sure, you do get the loyalty, but they don't submit. Not
It's not
unless you
true
do something like
loyalty.
you don't do something like what you do with Ingsoc in 1984. They don't submit. They want to bring people into the fold willingly, not beat someone into believing what they want.
Exactly. I mean, making someone do something with a gun to their head is way different than them doing it with their own free will. If you just beat someone's you beat the freedom out of them by just threats and fear and control, they're gonna do, at a certain extent, they're gonna do what you want, but they won't completely subscribe to what you believe. They won't fully be on your side as they would if they wholeheartedly believe what you had to say. And again, that's what we got with 1984. And while thankfully we in the world have not gotten to that stance, have not gotten to that point, it's, of course, that was the whole point of the book, to warn you about that. Because at the end of the day, this is what those leaders want. They want you to believe what they have to say and to willingly go along with their cause. And of course, since most people won't, that's where they have to make you fear them. They have to make you threatened by them in order to make you go along with it. But at the end of the day, that's not real submission. That's not real surrender. That's being forced. That's coercion. It's not a real abandonment of freedom. You would need to give that up. That's the only way, again, that you would get that those leaders would get that real respect.
Right, because you look at democratic leaders as well as dictators and even Ingsoc in 1984. They want people they don't want to force people into what they want. Even Ingsoc, they want to convince people, not just for the sake of stability, but also because there is an aspect of the Ingsoc leaders in 1984 that were still human. They still wanted people to believe in them, sure that they could get peace by forcing people into what they want. But that was the interesting thing about the main character, and he was in the prison, he was being tortured, the antagonist of the movie, I think it was um what was his name? Not
Maybe
important, but
don't
anyway.
say it. Maybe we don't spoil it. That's fine.
Right. Yeah, but like the antagonist of the book was telling the main character that um we don't want you to, there's still resistance in you. Why do you resist? We want you to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. Because there's a part of them that's still human. They still want people to love them. They want people to believe what they believe. They don't want to force other people into what they believe. And it's more than just pragmatism. They want this, you know. And the same with the dictator. The dictator, they want people to love them. They want more than just authority. That's why you have populist dictators right now that give the people what they want, but they still have that dictatorial tendency. but they give the people what they want, not just for stability, but it's also because they want people to love them. And then, of course, with democratic leaders, you have that as well. It's just minus the dictator tendencies. Because ideally, you'd have a society where people love you, and then there's a certain amount of social harmony, between the leader and those that are being led. And that's consistent amongst all levels of government, at least the ones that I can think of right now. Ingsoc, even Putin today, a populist dictator, or and other populists throughout history, as well as democratic leaders.
Yeah,
They all
I,
want to be loved. They all want people to willingly fall in line. That's why you have, again, populists, giving the people what they want so they can love them. It's more than just
exactly.
pragmatism.
A great one, and of course, we've all heard of Donald Trump. He wants to be loved. The crowds, he loves the crowds. So many crowds, the biggest crowd in history, period. He wants to be loved. People want to be loved at the end of the day. You don't want just people to be scared of you because they're not really going to believe what you got to say. You want to be loved. You want to be appreciated. You want people to join your side because they believe in you. So, because at the end of the day, that reaffirms with you that your worldview, your view of everything is correct. Like going back all the way to that earlier in the series, that quote by Hegel, um, you have your point of view of the world, and to you that's the correct one. When others come around, you want your point of view to be correct. And even at the end of the day, everyone kind of wants that. Who wants to be wrong? At some point, you want to be right. Um, so that's what those leaders want. They want to be loved. If that means they have to make people scared of them, sure. And more will be more apt to just make people fear them than try to do things that make people love them. But that's really what they want. Um, just to list off another example I have was of another fictional one. It's the character of Homelander in the show and the comic The Boys, and he's a character who is utterly terrifying. You know, laser eyes, very violent, uncomfortable around him, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, while many people are scared of him, what he really would always want is for people to agree with him, for people to validate what he wants to do and who he is correct. He wants the crowds and the people to love him. Um, that's why it was kind of a whole struggle for acceptance from others that he did so many violent things. I mean, at the end of season 3, if you haven't seen just the end series, he kind of feels himself freed because he has a group of people who love and appreciate him no matter all the violent stuff that he does. It's in a scene where he goes down to this crowd supporting him, and there's someone against him, and he laser eyes them, he kills them. But then the crowd cheers. They love him, and he stands there while surprised. He's happy because what at the end of the day he wanted to be loved. He wanted his full self to be appreciated. And at the end of the day, that's what so much of us want. We want to be heard, understood. We want people to go with who we are and accept who we are. And even then, that's kind of what leaders want. Like, take it to the world stage. That's what leaders want. If it's not just about themselves, it's about their worldview. They want people to subscribe and to believe it. If that means they have to fear them, sure. But at the end of the day, they just want to be appreciated, just like Homelander did in the series The Boys. Very good series. Go watch it.
Right. And these are all examples of how like dictators, democratic leaders, government, systems of government, people who just and everyday people, they want um they want a certain amount of organization. They want people to line up with what they want, you know, um beyond pragmatism, they just want to be loved. They want people to subscribe with their beliefs. They want people um to just like they want order. But they also want that certain amount of love that comes with with humanity, which I'm just now realizing is at the whole heart of peace v freedom. We want order. Like, and as we mentioned in the last couple episodes, is that we don't just need order, we want it. But then on top of that, we also want to be loved. So we also
We
want
want
that
the
freedom.
freedom to
We
be
want enough.
who, what we are.
Exactly. We want enough freedom for the people around us so that they can love us, you know? So ideally, in our minds, we actually do want peace and freedom, but we also want a balance, you know?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But then also, just a little bit of a transition to another idea that we had, because we have a lot of ideas in this big, huge idea, this huge concept of peace v freedom, and so it involves like looking at a lot of different aspects of that. So here we're going into another transition of authority, and we've already mentioned like examples of complete peace, but peace in totality, with no opposition, and this lines up, a bit of what we were just mentioning right there with people wanting to be loved, but, you know, but being loved without opposition, and in this case, it's much more pragmatic. It's not so much about loving someone. It's more or less about power. And this we have a lot of fictional examples, because we went into a lot of real life examples. I think it's also good for those of us that are watching that kind of need to like that need another way to imagine it, through a fictional lens, something that makes it easier for them to
Yeah.
picture all
You could
this.
see it. And of course, not everyone has read every history book on the planet. Not everyone knows about it. And so sometimes, a fictional example like 1984 or Star Wars or Avengers, something a lot easier to see. But just because it isn't real doesn't mean it's not important. It could give just as many real lessons as a real occurrence in history can. So they're not easily discarded. So yeah, that's kind of what we do that.
Exactly. So here are a few examples that we pieced apart, from a bunch of different types of fictional entities that talk about the same thing. Um, in the MCU, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there was a movie, Captain America movie, released about 8 years ago by this point, called Captain America: The Winter Soldier. And in that movie, Shield, the collective like world like defensive force against like aliens and whatever extraterrestrial threats, that was accepted as a very peacekeeping society, to defend the world, but then also to defend it from itself. And the biggest example of them defending against themselves was a totalitarian plot called Project Insight in the movie, where they would create like these drones off of these like floating helicarriers, um, like aircraft carriers, like just floating helicarriers, in where they would like have targets of people somehow using this algorithm to predict the future and predict who would cause harm. You know, they looked at people that might and were very likely to commit violence and harm in the future, whether it be, doing something in the next day or two or something years down the line, or even giving birth to someone that could end the world, you know. And somehow through Project Insight, this idea by Shield, that was secretly Hydra, if you watch the movie, um, is that they were going to predict what every person was going to do in the future, and they were trying to stop it. So it was the totality of the idea of creating peace. And then with Star Wars, we have an example, called the Tarkin Doctrine. Tarkin Doctrine, which people probably haven't heard of. It is the overall doctrine of the Imperial Navy, in the Galactic Empire under Palpatine and Vader. in where they would promote the fear of violence rather than violence itself. And that's why you have the Death Star, because, if you know anything about Star Wars, if you know a lot about Star Wars like I do, then you'll know that the Star Destroyers, like the big ships, they are probably more dangerous than the Death Star itself because they have the capacity of shooting down like a few of them, because the Imperial Navy had thousands of them. They would shoot down onto a rebellious planet, kill everyone on the planet, and the somehow, like, chemically, the material upon which the lasers that they would shoot from the ship, once they reached the Earth, they would actually form a glass layer, making the world that they had just shot down on the rebellious planet they just shot down, they turned the surface into glass somehow. And that was like the whole idea of it. But there's the Death Star, which is equally as terrifying because it's supposed to wipe out all rebellious systems. It was the epitome of the idea of fear of violence rather than violence itself that was going to stop, the rebellion. It was actually in the first movie of Star Wars that the rebellion had to take down the Death Star because they knew that if the Death Star was active, then they would be wiped out themselves. They knew that the Death Star would achieve its goal in suppressing dissent. And that's why it was so dangerous. And this is all folding under the doctrine, under the Galactic Empire called the Tarkin Doctrine. And then an example that I actually like the best, um, a show, that, I don't know how many people of us, that are watching have watched, but it's a show, you should really check it out, called The Man in the High Castle, about if the Axis, the Japanese and the Germans, were to have won World War II, and then 15, 20 years down the line, and society is being folded around their visions of the world, and they cut the world in half between the two of them into spheres of influence. And so there's a point in where the Nazis have full nuclear supremacy, you know, and they were about to nuke Japan and nuke all their territories and and take over the world, and the Nazis, they were justifying this because they believed this will be the last war, you know. So it really is interesting because the idea of uniting the world through territorial conquest always seemed impossible because there's so many nations, so many different people, so many points of view that it'd be impossible. But under Nazi leadership, they have their effective way of suppressing dissent. What if they could actually unite the world? And that's what I just found so interesting about that example. But then there's injustice, and Superman, with his supreme power, suppressing all dissent to create full peace. So these are all, fictional examples of creating peace, but they're equally as interesting as the real life examples that we've seen throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that ties them all together is fear. All of these use some sort of fear or some sort of violent action or some way that will incentivize people not to do quote unquote bad things. It's creating peace, it's creating order, it's creating a structure in society. And the only way that these groups, these empires, these superheroes do this is through violence. It's through fear. I mean, when you look at like the example of the Empire in their Tarkin doctrine, the whole epitome of it is that people will be so scared that they wouldn't have to rebel. They wouldn't need to blow up every single rebel planet because everyone else would be so scared to dissent or to rebel that they would just go along with the program. Everything that these ones do are out of fear and keeping people in check by making sure that they won't rebel because they're scared of the consequences. That isn't true peace. And so in these societies, these fictional societies in which they seek to create complete peace, it's never really peaceful. Because as we described earlier, the only way to get complete peace is to destroy the even the idea or the ability to believe in dissent, in anything else. You get rid of the idea of freedom completely. That's the only way to bring about complete peace. all these ways, like the man in the high castle, a war to end all war. This will be the last war. You will have, sure, they will have territorial dominance. They will suppress, all the rebellions, and there will be peace. But they will never fully be over. There will always be groups of people who believe in a better system, a better society, in freedom, civil rights, the American system, if it was based in America or something like that. There'll always be the people who hold those ideas. And as long as they do, it will never be complete peace. Even if that means there are not a lot of terrorist attacks or nothing like that, the Nazis would have never won because their ideology would never fully be accepted. Accepted. Because if people are just going along with it out of fear, that's not true belief. That's not true surrender. That's just someone with a gun to your head making you rob the bank. It's coercion. It's not true subversion. And so, therefore, with these societies, you'll never have complete peace. What you have is just complete fear and complete violence to get as close as they think they can get.
Right. And the next section that we want to get to, which we will not have time for, unfortunately, for this episode, will we'll be talking about, what happens when you like
Yeah, we'll look
what
at the
happens,
contrast to this. So we've been
right? The
talking about
contrast of
complete
this,
peace.
which actually has a really nice transition,
It
because I'm
does.
trying to think of a really good transition here, is that the like what if the people were able to get a taste of what it's like without order? Now, of course, he doesn't need to be as completely authority and like order based and no opposition based and totality based as the examples that we just listed. But what if the people were able to get a taste of what it'd be like without your order, your authority, your government, you know, and then they came back and said, no, we actually do want order, as a proof of example, of what it's like, when the people are given freedom, what happens, like what would make them come back to it? So that is what we're going to talk about in our next episode. Unfortunately, we will not have time for this one. So anyway, it was a really fun episode. We will get back on the idea of what it's like when the people give up their freedom because they know that it actually is just chaos. Um,
Yep.
um,
With
yeah.
that, we'll see what absolute freedom might look like. And yeah, with that, we're the Marshals of Truth.